All right, as soon as I get all my cords tucked in so I don't trip and fall right in front of all of you. First of all, one of the things that we try and do with our workshops that I really appreciate about what's been a part of all of the workshops this week is you get a little bit of, although you might have brought some real outsider from North Dakota in to speak, you also have those people that participate in the industry in a different way, and I think one of the most important parts of that is bringing in some local flavor, if you will, from the producer community. And of course, the first day there was a young gentleman by the name of CJ that presented about his farm, and of course JC the last couple of days, and I just think that's really important, and it actually illustrates then someone taking a lot of the principles that several of us others talk about and showing how those sorts of things actually apply and can be put on ground and in conditions like you deal with. So I think that's an important thing to consider and a very fortunate thing to be thankful for when those individuals are willing to share. I know from a producer standpoint, anytime that you start sharing things about your place or about your management, you're kind of putting yourself and your place on display, and that isn't always an easy thing to do. You end up being exposed a little bit, but I think it's a good learning opportunity for everyone in attendance. Now, trying to connect this presentation to the one I talked about this morning, I wasn't always interested in soil health. Okay, believe it or not. I wasn't always interested in holistic management and that sort of thing. When I was little, all I wanted to do was be a cowboy. Okay, that's really all I was interested in. I wanted to ride my horse, and of course I'd watch old Western type movies and look at it and say, I was really born about 100 years too late. Okay, but as I started watching more and more of the ranching operation that I was a part of and the ones that I got to help with and the ones I got to learn from, I realized pretty quickly that, it really wasn't about the horse or about wearing the hat or the boots or being a cowboy. So then I kind of transferred into this, I want to be instead of a cowboy or a horseman, I want to be a cattleman. Well, that lasted for a while, and then I moved along a little further and said, well, there's really another stage that I really should look at, and that's not being a cattleman, but that's maybe being a grass farmer, okay? And that one lasted for a little bit too, but as you keep on learning and as you keep on exploring, you realize that there's always this new frontier, and of course the current one that I'm on, and I'm not sure what the next one's going to be, but the current one is a microbe manager, okay? I didn't say micro, but microbe manager, okay, talking about the soil. And the thing with grazing or cropping or gardening or any of the other things, agriculture or non-agriculture that we do, we have to do it with some sort of purpose. Now, I talked earlier about how most people can tell you what they do, okay? A lot of people can even tell you how they do things, and they'll tell you about their model, they'll tell you about their methods, they'll tell you about their techniques. But when you ask them why they do something, then it gets a little more blurry. Then it gets a little bit more gray. And I think that's really important, whether you're talking about it from a marketing standpoint, from an effectiveness standpoint for the next hour of time, dollar of money, ounce of energy. Why you do something can really help you focus on being effective. And of course, again, efficiency follows that. But grazing with a purpose has taken on a whole new meaning for me. It's not just moving cows. It's not just watching grass. It's about accomplishing something. And understanding what we want to accomplish makes a big deal. Now, when we're grazing animals, and we've heard a number of things from the soils to the plants to the animals, even to the human component, there's lots of variables. Okay, there's lots of things that make this quite complex, but we know nature's complex, and that's okay. In fact, that's a good thing to accept and to appreciate. We've got things that deal with the animal, we've got things that deal with the forage itself, we've got things with the land or the soils that we need to consider, and of course we've got the people aspect of all this. Throw all that together, seems like it should be pretty complex, but in a pretty typical or conventional management of grazing, it really comes down to two variables. We want to make money, and we want to feed our livestock, right? Provide that nutrition. The only problem is it quite this simple? If we're truly going to take advantage of the benefits that can be had when we start managing for the health of an entire ecosystem, and Dr. Rayburn talked about being an ecosystem manager, right? And I agree with him wholeheartedly. I think that being an ecosystem manager means that you manage the whole situation. You manage all of these things simultaneously. That's why understanding the parts is good, but understanding their relationships is what completes that whole circle of management. So, if it's more complex than that, then we got to figure on there's this human component. And in my experience, there's an emotional human component that plays into all of this. Now this here is the entry road into our particular ranch. That's my father standing next to the vehicle there. This was about 3 or 4 years ago when we had about 110 inches of snow. If you ask people to tell you about what they need to manage for, or better yet, what they need to have insurance for, you will hear about the flood of 66. You will hear about the winter of 84. You will hear about the flood of 97. And you will, if you're from South Dakota, you'll definitely tell them about Winter Storm Atlas that happened in October of 2013. Those are pretty significant events. I'm sure you have your own here in Virginia or in the Carolinas or wherever you're stationed at or operate from. But my question is do we have to operate in the worst case scenario every day that it's not happening? Probably not. Now, is it worthwhile to have a contingency plan to take care of situations like this when they come? Certainly. But because of the winters that I just described to you, the typical operation in North Dakota will feed starting in probably October or November, and they'll feed all the way until May. Well, that's more of the year that they're feeding than not feeding. And if you attended the workshops when Jim Garish was here, if I remember the times that I've been able to listen to him, he brings up a statistic where he says the amount of days that hay is fed to animals in Minnesota, in Missouri, and in Mississippi is absolutely the same. How come? Now, I'm not saying any one place has more right or less right to feed hay than the other, but isn't it kind of interesting that everybody's movement is to feed hay? That's just kind of become a reflex rather than an insurance policy. And in Grazing with Purpose, we're going to look at it as an insurance policy that needs to be in place when situations like this happen, but to take your opportunity when it's there for the taking. Play some offense. Don't just play defense all the time. Okay, a good team plays both, but you need to score some points. You need to have some offense if you're going to take advantage of the opportunities. And if that's the case, then our goals with a holistic type of grazing plan need to be more. Okay? Do we still want to make money? Certainly. It's part of a business. You want to be profitable. Do we need to meet the nutritional needs of livestock? Yes. Anybody here have wildlife on their place that consumes some or part of the forage that you produce? Okay? There was a little bit of a groan when some of you raised your hand. Okay? The Brown Ranch that I highlighted earlier, a few winters ago when we had all of that massive amount of snow, okay, on their operation, their hay pile fed close to 900 white-tailed deer. Why did they show up at his place? There was actually something to have. Okay, now I'm not saying you're trying to attract wildlife. All I'm saying is, are you accounting for the amount of wildlife that may consume some or part of your forage? Rancher in Colorado, a really good mentor of mine. He's got an operation down there where darn near half of the forage in their grazing plan every year is consumed by an elk herd. Do they need to account for the elk herd in their grazing plan? Certainly. So we're accounting for living critters, not just the livestock. We're going to utilize the tools of grazing and animal impact to improve the land. We can do multiple things simultaneously. Okay? We've got animal performance, we've got land performance. We don't necessarily have to sacrifice one for the other, but we do have to create certain strategic timing in order to make that happen. We want to grow as much forage as we can during the growing season. We want to be able to ration out the forage that hopefully you grew during the growing season that you didn't consume during the growing season. Now, if you normally consume all of your forage, all of your standing forage during the growing season, and decide about October that you would like to become a winter grazer, are you going to be able to pull that off? Probably not. Okay? Often in North Dakota, South Dakota, Montana, and that sort of area there, when we start talking about people, they'll manage the way they've always managed, and then all of a sudden want to jump and reap the benefits from a different management scheme. Well, there's a lot of planning that goes into that. There's a lot of changes and transitions that go into that. So if you want to have grazing or if you want forage to graze during the winter, we have to plan for it the season before. Okay, it's kind of like when you plan for drought. When do most people plan for drought? Or make changes according to drought? When the drought's already in place, right? When should you plan for drought? The wettest year you get. That's when you have opportunity. That's when you can stockpile forage. That's when you have time to think with clarity and focus because you're not under as much stress. That's when you have some flexibility to spend some time doing that. But most of the time we wait until it hits us and then we decide that out of urgency we need to do something. So every time, and don't get me wrong, I understand the pressure and the stress that can go along with managing livestock or crops. And when you get a good year, it's very tempting to sit back, relax, and say, you know, I'm just going to appreciate that things are working pretty good this year. Well, there's nothing wrong with that, except that also takes some of that time to be planning into the future so that the bad doesn't have to be so bad in the future, and the good can keep getting better. Plan for and survive drought, just talked about that. Create a low-stress environment for animals and people. How many here like to work cattle? Okay. How many here have spouses who like to work cattle with them? Or maybe it's pretty good at the early part of the day. How about at the end of the day? Okay. Growing up, and of course the crew that I get to travel with this week have heard this over and over, but it never ceases to amaze me when I think about this from the past. But my brother's the oldest of 10 siblings. Okay, and my father, he's got 6 younger brothers. Well, when I was little, younger, probably 10, 12 years old, and I could start helping with the livestock, it'd be my cousin, who's a year older than me, myself, my father, his father, and my dad's 6 younger brothers to work these cows. Nobody did anything the same. Nobody was on the same page, and I'm not trying to say they're dysfunctional. It's just fairly common that everybody comes and everybody hollers, and of course the hollering turns to swearing, and of course it goes on and on from there. I used to hate working cattle. My father and I decided to take a different approach here several years ago. Now we probably work 3 times as many cattle, but we can do it much quicker than we used to. But we have it as part of our grazing plan to make sure they're in the places that we need at the critical points, whether it's calving or breeding or weaning or branding or whatever it might be, that they're in the critical points, and we plan outward from there. And of course, we've continued our education in that realm too, going to low-stress animal handling, learning better stockmanship techniques, learning animal behavior. That all goes along with being able to manage. And they thought, well, we've got these awesome facilities, so we don't need to do that. I was more interested in the animal handling so I can improve the gain on my animals as much as anything. Okay? But whether it's performance on the animal, help to manage your landscape the way that you want, whatever it might be, encourage yourself to just keep learning, keep reading, keep listening, keep talking to people, whatever exploration you need to do. And of course, this last one, integrate all other social, financial, and environmental events. You're thinking, Josh, come on, this is a grazing plan. This is not the company's strategic 10-year plan. Maybe it should be. No, I'm not saying it has to be the strategic 10-year plan, but if you look at all of these variables and all the things that you would like to see on your place happen, and happen effectively, and help you reach the thresholds or goals that you have, you need a plan to do that. Now, a plan is just that. It's something on paper, but the planning process is absolutely invaluable. because that's where you do your inventory, that's where you learn how you're going to make decisions, that's where you learn how you're going to deal with things as they come along the way. But you see, unless you know what you want in the first place, how do you know if you're moving in the right direction? How do you know when you get there? Okay, when you leave today, you jump in your pickup or your car and you start driving down the road. And you just drive because you're supposed to leave. Okay? You're not driving anywhere in particular, you're just driving. Is that going to get you where you want to go? Now maybe your vehicle's made the same trip over and over and over again and it just knows the way like an old horse. But if you don't know where you're going, how do you know if you're going the right direction? This was one of the best things that our operation did. And when I say our operation, I'm talking about my wife and I, my sister who has some interest in the ranch, my parents who are still on the ranch. When everybody together puts a landscape description together so you know what you're working towards and everybody takes ownership in it, then all of a sudden you have trust in the rest of your team members that they are going to make decisions that move in this direction. So not everybody has to be governed. Not everybody has to check with everybody else every time a decision needs to be made. And this one's pretty general. Ours has gotten more specific as time has gone on. What do you guys want your landscape to look like? And you can't copy mine. What do you want to see?
Diverse forage space to support livestock.
What's that?
Diverse forage space to support.
Okay, diverse forage base
Grazing operation.
to support grazing or a long-term grazing operation. Okay, so diversity. What else? It doesn't. There's no right answer. It's what you guys want to see. And if you shout, go ahead. Okay, abundant fertility for your grandkids. I know you don't have grandkids yet, but I like the way you're thinking. I don't have grandkids yet either, but I see through my kids' eyes and through my parents' eyes, which then have that connection, that that's important. Okay? Other than health, fertility, diversity, profitable. What is going to make it profitable? I can put it all into corn and I can be profitable. I'm looking for specifics.
For me, it's setting up a system that I can pass down as, was passed down to us.
Okay. So a systems approach, something you can use as an educational tool and a teaching tool. Anybody want trees? Anybody want water? What kind of water? Clean water. All of these things go into describing what you want your landscape to look like. Okay? When you go in to have to put together a conservation plan with those people that are really good at what they do and helpful in what they can assist you with, to be able to describe to them what you want to see, does that not help them to be a better member of your team, to help you make that plan? And to come in there and have a goal, and believe me, if you have to write it down, this is not easy. When you have to actually, I've got it in my head. Yeah, I've had lots of things in my head, and there's more things that probably leave my mind in the last few years than I'm able to pack in there anymore. But when you put it on paper, that's not easy, but it is powerful. It is really, really powerful. If you serve on a board, if you are a part of an organization or an agency, or you're part of a land management team, is everybody on the same page? Or does everybody have their little parts that they're working on and you're afraid to not give an inch because they might take a foot type of thing? Okay, landscape description. And maybe it requires an outside third-party facilitator or something to make that happen, and lots of people can play that role, but a landscape description, I think, is really, really important. So how do we take this very, very complex thing and cut it down to the why, the how, and the what? Getting the animals to the right place at the right time for the right reasons. Just because the forage is gone in the last pasture is not a good enough reason to move to the next one. Now, I'm not saying you shouldn't move them, because what are your animals going to eat if you don't move them? But if that's what your whole rotation is based on, eat this one till it's gone, and then eat that one till it's gone, eat that one till it's gone, and hopefully by the time I come back around, there's some forage regrown. That's just moving cows. Okay? We can move cows as fast as you want. We can open gates as fast as you want. We can make it a dead sprint if you want, and you're moving cows. You might be watching grass. That doesn't constitute reaching your goals or accomplishing your objectives with a grazing plan. It is more than that. We want to find the purpose behind all of that. The first principle to me in all of this, and the reason that this one's number one is because I think it supersedes all of the other ones. If we can get this part right, I believe that you're well on your way, at least we were, well on our way to making significant progress on our land for our plant health, soil health, animal health, and of course, final product. The story behind this picture here, on our particular ranch, there's a 45-acre pasture that's on the north side of the farmstead, and we moved onto the place when I was 3. This was in the early 80s, and as long as I can remember, that 45 acres has been the horse pasture. 365 days a year, anywhere from 3 to 6 horses over the years. Okay, they're just on that 45 acres year-round. You guys know how horses graze, and I'm not trying to throw horses under the bus because I like horses, but you know how they graze, right? What do you think that pasture looked like after 30 years, or close to 30 years, of continuous season-long grazing with that number of horses? Everything that's good for a horse is gone. What else? Think there are some things out there that you wouldn't be real fond of seeing? Okay? So there's areas that are completely wiped out of certain species, for the most part. There's weeds in places. There's trails. There's overgrazing here and no grazing over here. And I've got more pictures that I'm not exactly proud of, but I'll show them to you on our place with this scenario. But what we decided to do is we took that 45 acres, we used temporary fence, and we split it into 3. Okay, it's got a creek that runs along the base of it, so that was the water source for this, but we split this into 3. And the far one, the 16 acres on the far east side, I told my dad, I said, we're just not going to touch that one at all in 2009. We're just not going to touch it at all. Okay, it's been under pressure for 30-some years. Let's just leave it alone. We'll see what happens. Well, I'll be honest with you, during that year, and because I live an hour from the ranch, I kind of forgot about it. Now, we never turned anything out there other than what deer or other things might have had access to it. But in September of that year, September of 2009, my wife and I and a good friend of mine, we went riding. And after we got done with our ride, I said, I've never looked at that pasture since we left it for a whole growing season. I said, let's just go take a peek at it. And I grabbed my camera, we brought it along. And in our area, one of the historical references we use is the journals of Lewis and Clark. Okay, and one of the things they talk about is being able to ride through the tall grass prairie, and how on horseback they could ride and the grass would be as tall as the saddle horn. Okay, well, these 2 horses here are both close to 16 hands, so they're pretty good-sized horses. And in this pasture here, not the whole thing, but on this particular bench, which is up quite a ways from the creek, so it's not like it's in a wet meadow or anything, we could do exactly that. The grass was this high as I sat in the saddle, okay, at the saddle horn or above. Prairie sandreed, big blue stem. I know what those species look like, but I'd never seen them before, not in this pasture. I didn't seed anything. Where did they come from? They've always been there, right? And either one of 2 things, I think, was happening there. Either those horses were getting to them when they were so small every year that they were nipping them off and we didn't see them. Okay, it set them back all the time. Overgrazing type of scenario. And it's not the horse's fault. Okay, you can blame the horses all you want. It's not their fault. It's not the cows, not the sheep, not the chickens, not the horses. It's the management. Okay, and the management was on me. The other reason is that the seed bank is probably full of seeds. The soil bank is probably full of seeds, just like your soils are probably full of different seeds and a diversity of seeds. But if they never have the opportunity, they're not going to show up. Or if every time they have tried to show up, they get hit so hard, they just don't want to be a part of it anymore. Okay? 1 year, 1 growing season, All of a sudden I had so much excitement that my wife and the friend of mine finally said, Josh, why don't you and your horse just stay out here? We're going in to eat. And I did. I stayed out there for another hour, and I took picture after picture after picture because I was just so enthralled and so excited about what kind of production we were getting. Now, is this stuff awesome nutrition at this time of year in this state? No. But which herd was I feeding? The one below ground, right? Every once in a while, it's probably beneficial to work on feeding them and use different pastures or different fields to feed the ones above ground. Because of this little experiment that we did, and I encourage everybody to do a little bit of their own experimentation, but because we did that, there is one pasture on our ranch every year that gets to go through this type of rest period, the entire growing season, without being touched. Now, if you have lots of pastures or lots of paddocks, that's easy to do, and you pick a different one every year. Now, we might still come in during the winter with cattle or something like that and try and graze it. They might trample more than they eat, but that's okay. We'll lay down quite a bit of material. But every year we have at least one, maybe more than one, and we pick the one that needs it the most, and that's the one that we work through the system that way. So you see, this thing isn't about finding the one method or model to where you do the same thing to every pasture all the time. When we get done during the year, there's some pastures that we hit fairly hard if we think that they needed impact or we needed some legume stimulation. There's some pastures that we don't touch at all because they get tremendous recovery and lots of buildup of high carbon plants to feed the soil. There's some that we do the take half, leave half thing. There's some that we do 20% and leave 80%. There's some that we flip that ratio. There's some that we graze in the spring, and then the next year we don't graze it till the fall. There's some that we graze during the winter, and then the next year it's the summer. You see this chaos that goes on? And this isn't just because I'm some sort of random and unorganized person. In fact, it is a very strategic organization process, but without a plan, I would be lost. Without a plan, my father would not be able to follow through on the logistical nightmare that would become if you're shooting from the hip. So grazing with purpose, recovery time being a very important part. This here is just some, please be careful about paying attention to those numbers. Those are generalizations, general windows that we would use for different species, types of species in our area. Depends on whether it's wet or dry. Depends on if it's hot or cool. Depends on how it started in the spring, how it finishes in the summer. But I can tell you that even though these are the recommendations for some of these, just like I said this morning, most of our critters on the farm don't necessarily read the book. Now, these numbers were established with good intent based on research and experimentation, and they're good guidelines to start with. But when we left that one pasture for an entire growing season, did it fall into one of those windows? It was far greater than any one of these particular windows. But if we had never done that, we would never see what that gets you. Okay? A little bit later, I'll show you something that you might be able to try that I think is important. Here's a picture very similar to what Dr. Rayburn had on there before, just showing you a little bit about the amount of forage that we have above ground and showing what that can give us below ground. If you were going into a drought, which one of these do you want? I'll give you the one on that side if you want, although you might be upset with me if I would do that. This one over here, if you're going into a drought, if you're looking for more fertility, if you're looking to build organic matter, if you're looking for all of those soil health items and trying to address some of those, it's all about the roots. And it's all about feeding those particular microbes. If we keep nipping it down and cutting it down over here, whether it's mechanical or even by livestock, eventually that starts taking so much from these reserves that there's just not much left for it to perform. This is the biggest thing in our area is giving that adequate recovery time so we can develop roots. Ken Miller, one of the best grazers in the country that I know of, and for extreme benefit on my part, actually sits in the cubicle next to me at the Soil Conservation District. Okay, he probably, if you'd ask him, he probably wouldn't admit this, but I'm sure there's days where he gets a little bit tired of me peeking over the wall, asking him another question. Okay, but I figured I better ask him questions while I have the chance, because he's the type of guy that he doesn't need to be working that job, but he believes so much in helping people improve their soil health and their cropping and grazing systems that he does this sort of thing anyway. But on his place, he talked about, he went to a holistic grazing management class back in the mid-'80s. And at that point, he was, the reason he went, okay, it was a week-long course, and of course in the mid-'80s, he had to get himself to Albuquerque. It cost him like $1,500 to go for the week, and I mean all the other expenses that go along with that. But he said, I had nothing to lose, because he said I either was going to do something different and hope for the best, or else I was going to start losing parts of my farm. Okay, so it was starting to get that bad. He comes back from that course and he decides he's going to start managing differently, and he did. He put in paddocks, he put in water, he started basing his grazing on recovery time. He tried to minimize the overgrazing, which we'll get to in a minute. And he said for the first 4 years, he said he didn't notice any difference. None. If you go through a year and don't see any difference, do you start to wonder whether it works? How about 2 years of no difference? 3. How many here would make it through 4 years of not seeing any change and would still keep going? Most people probably wouldn't. Year number 5, the previous 4 years had been drier than average, not necessarily drought, but drier than average. Year number 5, they got adequate rainfall. He grew 3 times as much forage as he had ever grown before. What happened during those 4 years? He was building this. Until you have this, you're not going to get the benefits from this. It took us how many eons and decades to bring the health of the soil downward into a degraded state, and yet we want to jump it back up in 1 or 2 years? Probably not realistic. Okay? Can we do it quicker? The more that we know and the more people that we can rely on, the more we don't necessarily have to reinvent the wheel, certainly. But we have to be patient to let the right things that we invite to the party actually show up, start working, doing their thing, building the roots, and therefore giving us some of those benefits for the future. This Ken Miller also talks, and I mentioned this morning, about how many pastures you have, and how people, well, they want the extra grass so they can run more animals, but they don't necessarily want to build fences. We can build some pretty inexpensive, pretty low maintenance type of fences. And some of them don't even necessarily have to be permanent. We've built lots of temporary fences on our place until we found that we were maybe putting the same temporary fence in the same place for a number of years in a row. Then we decide, yep, that's a place where we can put something more permanent. But we don't think of it as building fences. We think of it as building recovery time. Okay, and what does recovery time get us? It gets us more roots. Therefore, it gets us more biology. It gives us more grass on top. It allows us to run more cows, etc., etc. But we had the concept, the principle is building recovery time, not another fence for you to maintain. Okay, overgrazing. And this is probably common and well known to everybody, but I'll throw up these 3 items anyway. This first one here, if animals stay in a pasture or a paddock too long, okay? If they graze over there, and then they graze up here, then maybe they graze back here. After they're done here, where do you think they go back to? Probably back over there, and follow the same path. Well, we end up with overgrazing in these areas. Okay, and by definition, overgrazing is when a plant has, if it's been bitten once, and it has tapped into its root reserves to start regrowth again, and while it's extremely vulnerable, it gets hit again. Okay, so it's that second bite after regrowth has started to occur. If animals are in the same area for too long, this can happen. It can also happen if animals return too quickly. Okay, before the plant has fully recovered, which means that you can rotate cows, you can watch grass, and still end up overgrazing. Now keep in mind that overgrazing, in my opinion, still takes a back seat to getting your recovery time right first. Okay? Overgrazing then, to minimize that or eliminate that, becomes the second protocol to step into and to follow through. An example of this right here, and I hope I haven't told you this story before, but after giving this presentation several times, I'm starting to figure out what I've said and what I haven't said. But the story I want to share with you is actually out of Central Florida. I had a chance to teach a class down there several years ago. And there was a gentleman there that he kind of just sat in the back and he didn't say a whole lot. And the only interaction I had with him during the class is when we asked him a question. And he said, I'm probably a long ways further than anybody else in the class with grazing. So I'm just going to let everybody else learn, and I'm just going to sit back here and be quiet. Okay, I didn't really like that response, but I thought, well, maybe he's got something really good going on. And he did say that he moves cows every 3 days. Well, that might tell you something, and more than likely, but that's not the whole story. But anyway, he asks us me and the other instructor, he asks us to come out to his place. He's like, I'd like to give you a tour. He's like, I'd like to show you my place. It's beautiful. Okay? Well, when you come from North Dakota and you go visit Florida in March, it does look kind of beautiful. Okay? It's very different. It's much warmer. It's green. All right? But we go out to his place and we say, okay, take us to the cows. We want to not only see your cows, but also the pasture that they're in. So we go out, we see this pasture and the cows. Show us where the cows just were. Okay? Go over here. We see where the cows just were. Please show us where the cows are going to go after they're done in the paddock that they're in. Okay, go over here. We look at that paddock. Okay? Show us the rest of it. As long as we're here, we want to see the rest of the system. What do you mean? Well, we want to see that you said you're moving every 3 days. I do. You only have 3 paddocks? Well, sure. Three paddocks moving every 3 days. How much recovery time does any one of those paddocks get? It gets 6 days, right? Trust me, I know grass grows fast in Florida. It doesn't grow quite that fast. Okay? Throw in a burning operation in the middle once in a while, and it really has a big negative effect on there. But the point is that you can rotate. Okay? But if you come back around too soon, you can have the same detrimental effect from an overgrazing standpoint. I would rather you slow it down and stay in a paddock a little too long, but have the appropriate recovery time follow it to compensate for it. It's kind of like if you go work out and you're working those muscles and you maybe take it a little too far. You push it a little too hard. You know, you do one of these exercises that they call suicides or something like that. Okay, we used to do those in high school and for different sports. And of course, if you took it too far, you could technically hurt yourself. How do you get over being hurt? Rest. Recovery. It might be longer, but rest and recovery is what gets you there. But if you just keep coming back and hitting it and hitting it and hitting it, that recovery time, the most important part, never takes place to the extent that it really needs to. In this third one, animals graze a paddock too soon following dormancy. Okay? June 1 is the magical date in North Dakota that you're supposed to wait to turn animals out onto the native prairie because then it's had enough time to get started and get going. I doubt anybody told the buffalo that they were supposed to stay confined somewhere until June 1 before they could go out there. And I'm not trying to make fun of the tech guide or wherever those numbers came from because they probably were based on experimentation done with forage amounts and reduced forage amounts if you did graze it too soon or too early. But the point is if you have all of these different paddocks, you have lots of management flexibility. In any given year, you might graze one of those too soon or at the wrong time. And as long as it's not the same one every year, I think you'll be just fine. In fact, to make the whole rest of the system work, every once in a while, one of those paddocks so-called takes one for the team. But if it's the same one that has to take one for the team year after year after year, then that one's eventually going to suffer. Okay, so it's a matter of managing this chaos, completely changing up the timing, the intensity, the frequency, all of those things. And that's where knowing what happened last year or even the previous 2, 3, 4 years on any of those given paddocks makes a difference in how you're going to manage it the next year. This pasture here is about 10,000 acres in size, has about 100 cows grazing it. What do you see in that picture? I know the picture is a little bit hard to see, but does it look like there's some overgrazing? Why in that area? Okay, the water's there. Okay, let's drop her down to 80 cows. Does that fix the problem? How about 50? 20? 2? So you're telling me that this overgrazing is happening. Doesn't matter if there's 1 cow out there or 100 cows out there. You're saying that she, unless you have an oddball, is going to stay right next to the water because the water's there? I would assume the same thing. So the point is that this isn't based on numbers. Now we still have to pay attention to our stocking rate. It's not like you can just have overabundance of numbers. You still have to have the appropriate stocking rate for the number or the amount of forage that you have. But when we start talking about density or any given paddock, overgrazing is a function of time, exposure time, not a function of the number of animals at any given moment. Okay? Now in this one here, a pasture of that size, I would guess utilization is pretty sporadic. This is a low rainfall, low production type environment. Looks like there's some pretty good side hills full of sagebrush. So there's lots of things that probably need to be considered. But it's not uncommon to have areas like this. Now when we get into some future or some slides up ahead here, we will talk a little bit more about the impact on water and forage and those sorts of things. Now quality aside, do you see grass in this picture? Okay. So we've got grass, a dog, and a horse. How about this picture? Not much grass, right? Guess what? Not my proudest moment. Okay, that is my horse, my dog, our pasture. The joke I often make is, I took half and left half. Isn't that the rule? Probably the wrong context, though, right? You see, I took darn near, and actually this was a custom herd that they came through, but I took darn near everything here, took very little up here. Lots of room for improvement. What could I do differently? What's that? Say that again.
Fence off the overgrazed area.
Okay, fence off the overgrazed areas and do what with it? Okay. This needs the tool of rest, just like you identified. How about that one up there? Does that need more rest? It needs impact. Okay? Now, I haven't gotten quite good enough to tell my cows, you want to head over to that area over there and dance around a bit. And while you're over there, make sure that you don't eat anything on the way over. Okay? I also haven't convinced my cows that you need to stop when you get to down 50% on any given plant where the take half, leave half thing is. But you see, we can influence some of those things by our time management, our management of fences, our herding techniques, our animal movement techniques, and we can address some of these things because this isn't good for my land, or the land, I should say. I agree with JC that on whether we own land or not, or whether it's just in our care for a while. But this isn't doing any favors to this ground here, but neither is this. Okay? The wildlife don't want this. They don't necessarily want this either. Okay? It's dead. It's stagnant. There's nothing there. There's a little bit of cover, but that's not going to last long if there's no food. Okay? So you're right. We need more rest and we need more impact, all in the same thing. Now, if we can divide this up, if we can create an attractant in one area and a detractant in somewhere else, then we can start to work on these things. One of the ways that we can do that goes with this concept right here. We have cell number 1 right here. Okay, 8 pastures. We have cell number 2 or system number 2, 32 pastures. Same acreage on both. Same 50 cows on each. The stocking rate is same, right? The stocking density is 4 times greater on the other one, right? You see, there's 50 cows in here on this system. There's 50 cows in this system. This one here probably moves every day. This one over here probably moves every 4 days. Okay, if you want to think about it that way. Which one's going to have better utilization? More even utilization? Probably. Okay, with more density. Which one's going to have better manure distribution? Okay, probably. Okay, and the reason I say probably is because we don't know the forage conditions, we don't know topography, we don't know water sources, a whole bunch of other things. But in general, the principle to increasing your stock density is to work on some of those things. This right here would be one of the options for tools to hit on that area up there. Now, do we have to use fencing in order to create that effect? It's not our only tool, though. Okay? Fencing is probably the most common technological tool that we use, but it's not necessarily the only one. Now, if we're truly going to have this increase in profits, we got to take care of the product that comes out of the factory, and we need to take care of the factory itself. Okay? So what I want to talk about here to finish out is each of those 2 items and how we need to try and balance those. So the first one here is livestock, but in the performance mode. Okay? Performance during the growing season. Okay? In our part of the world, that's not real hard to manage. Okay? There's things you got to monitor, there's things you got to watch for, but for the most part, green grass growing is a pretty easy thing to manage. The only problem with that is I've always been taught to keep it in the vegetative state at all costs, all the time. And that's not always the case. Now, if you want performance, most of the time vegetative state is going to be better than a high carbon state. You remember the 2 horses standing in that real tall grass? But keep in mind what Dr. Rayburn said this morning when he talked about the fiber content. Okay? Sometimes our best gains come on pastures that have lush green growth from the current year, but still have some material left from the previous year. Okay? You know how a cow eats and they'll take that tongue and they call it the whip action, where they grab and they'll grab whatever plants are there? They're not quite as specific as like a sheep or a horse, and they'll grab a little bit of everything that's right in that area. Now, they're still pretty selective by all means, but if this is all they have access to, it can be pretty green, it can be pretty hot. You might not want to stand directly behind them too close. Okay? Anybody watch their dung pats in terms of looking at them for nutrition? Okay? What are you looking for? What would you like to see? What's that? Okay, when it drops down, it's round in shape. It doesn't pile up. It doesn't clump up. Okay, if you get more specific, you can start peeling some of that apart, and depending on what kind of stickiness it's got, what kind of color it's got, all of those things play into nutrition. Well, if it's shooting out the backside to where you can't even keep track of it, then there's probably too much of something and not enough of another thing. And of course, you can go the opposite extreme, and there's not enough energy or there's not enough fiber, all of those sorts of things. So all I'm trying to say is there still needs to be this balanced ration. Okay? I've seen some people get into trouble because they will rotate so fast trying to keep everything in a vegetative state that they will come back too soon. And of course, then we're talking about a land performance thing that might be disturbed. So it's a constant, delicate balance, a dynamic equilibrium that you're constantly playing with animal performance and land performance. I'm not saying vegetative state is a bad thing. I'm not trying to convince you of that. All I'm saying is that we can go too far one way or too far the other, and from an animal performance standpoint, we need to make sure that they have access to the things that they need. There's times where we have cover crops in the late summer, early fall that are so green, so lush, so full of water that they're just awesome to look at. And the best thing we can do for the animals that we turn out into that cover crop is to also drop a really dry straw bale out there. And you think, well, why would they want to eat that dry straw bale? Well, if their digestive feedback is kicking back to them saying, I need something to fill me up, something that goes along with this real lush stuff, if they don't have access to it, then all of a sudden we start to have some issues. How about animal performance in the dormant season, or the winter season, or the ice or tundra season? Depends on where you come from. That probably tends to get more attention in our area because we tend to be quite a bit lower in protein, quite a bit lower in energy, and we may need to supplement. Now it sounds, in listening to some of you, about from a fescue standpoint, there's a little bit of an unfair advantage for you at times with some of the nutrition that maybe is still in that from a stockpiled standpoint. But what we're trying to do, remember, is trying to ration this out over time and get as far as we can. Now the concept between being able to move cattle on a fairly frequent basis is if you've got one pasture, you turn them all out there and you say, we'll see you at the end of the winter, what does the nutritional level in that pasture do every day that they're out there? Just keeps dropping, right? All the way through. What happens if you move them on a daily basis, like JC was talking about? Over the course of that day, it probably drops. What happens when you turn them into a new paddock? It picks back up some. Now, in general, the trend is probably still going to be slightly downhill because it's degrading because of weather, but you're going to maintain something higher than the steep decline that you would have otherwise. Generally, we put a plan together, a growing season grazing plan, and have a separate plan for the dormant season. Okay? Because the management's different enough, the classes of animals have changed from the one value category to another. There's just as much soil health that you can work on during the winter months as during the summer months. You're just not necessarily going to have the same things to monitor or the same type of immediate feedback that you get when things are growing. Okay, it's a little bit different. But how about the landscaping mode? If we're truly going to talk about soil health, if you have four-legged ruminant critters on your place, you have some of the best tools that you could have. This one's going to be hard to see because this picture's dark, but what shows up in that top picture, which was in September of 2012, and this is on this is a good friend of mine on his place, but there's only one species of grass. It's gray in color, it's laid down, it's kind of oxidized, although there's good ground cover, it kind of has the same look as that oilseed radish had when it was planted by itself. Okay, there's just nothing there. There's just no life to it whatsoever. He went and he provided impact on that area, and I'm not sure what his stock density was or if it was truly mob grazing or what, but this is a year later because that part of that pasture needed some treatment. Now we've got goldenrod, so we've got forbs, we've got silverleaf scurf pea, so we've got legumes, we got a couple different species of grasses in there. If we could see that a little bit better, there's some more in there as well. But we can see some things fairly quickly, but we actually have to watch for them. And we have to look at them. This is just one of the things that animal impact can do. Keeping in mind that animals don't actually have to eat the forage in order to stimulate things such as the mineral cycle. They just have to impact it somehow. Okay? They can graze it. They can drool on it. They can rub hair on it. They can lay on it. They can poop on it. They can pee on it. They can create the hoof action with their feet. Somehow, some way, the impact is what stimulates the movement process of nutrients. How many animals does it take to create a mobbing type effect? Okay, might be as little as one. The mobbing type effect is basically a change in behavior. Now, when you hear the numbers such as 30,000 pounds per acre or 40,000 pounds per acre, I've tended to see the same things, that when you get up to those types of numbers per acre, their behavior changes based on the fact that there is more of them in a smaller area. But if you can create that behavior change without having to put up fence and move water and that sort of thing, you can create that behavior change in other ways. In this particular case, we have a plant here that's called buckbrush. Western snowberry is another name for it. And in our area, I don't want to get rid of it. Okay, it's good wildlife food, it's good wildlife cover, but if it gets so dominant in an area, it will start to choke everything else out underneath it. Okay, which then doesn't allow our landscape description that we wrote down to actually be met or be moving in that direction. So we want to open it up some. We don't want to eradicate it, we just want to open it up. This right here is a salt block. This right here is a trace mineral block. This one here was more than one cow, it was 2 cows. But if you see them when they go after, if you ever take out grain, if you ever take out range or pellets, range cubes or pellets, that sort of thing, if you put out salt, if you put out mineral or molasses licks or something like that, you see how, if they really want it, what they will do. Okay? They skirt around it, they will fight with each other, they'll do lots of things in order to create movement that's not their normal ho-hum, follow in a single file line type thing. This here was over the course of 2 days. Now I'm sorry that I don't have an after picture. I need to go, this was last year, I need to go back out and see where it's at before, but we did one here, and we had another lick that we put up here. We may not do this exact same thing here for, well, who knows? It could be 5 years, 10 years, 20 years, maybe never in my lifetime, I'm not sure. But those are just little things, inexpensive things. Most of the time in our area, the salt blocks, guess where they get put? As close to the gate that you drive in as possible, or next to the water because you're going to go check that anywhere. Well, around a water tank, is there usually a lack of impact? Not usually. Okay, if you put them in the corners of pastures, is there usually a lack of impact in the corners? Not usually. If you want to get cattle to other places that they don't normally go, kind of like the yellow grass with the horse picture deal, this probably worked just as good as anything. It wouldn't require fencing, wouldn't require water, and it's really an inexpensive way to start. And if you impact this land and it starts to grow more green grass, forbs, legumes, then do you think that encroachment is just going to come right back? The cattle are actually going to want to be in that area then. It's one more area that they can utilize. Therefore, you don't necessarily have to repeat the same treatments over and over. This here, real quick, one of our crested wheatgrass is a grass that got seeded quite a bit to stop erosion decades and decades ago. It hangs on really well. It's very persistent. It's also allelopathic, so it supports itself, doesn't let a whole lot else be a part of that plant community. And of course, although it did its job from an erosion standpoint, it has a very short grazing window in the spring, okay, of good palatable forage. And then it dries up pretty quickly, and that's all that's on that site. So trying to introduce diversity is the idea that either you take it all the way out, or at least that's common thought, take it all the way out, or try and get something interseeded. That's kind of hit or miss. Well, this gentleman here said, I'm going to try something different. Experimented a little bit. I know you can't see those words real well, but over on this side, there is a little bit of alfalfa with all of that crested wheatgrass. But on this side, he took 70 heifers, and during the summer months, he moved those 70 heifers on 1 acre units. And he did have portable water. Okay, that's how he got them around. And he changed that in one growing season. He changed it from crested wheatgrass and alfalfa to western wheatgrass and alfalfa. Western wheatgrass is probably pretty high on our list of species, of desirable species. But it was only in the heaviest impacted areas that you found that to take place. And the reason I throw this slide in there is because as many good things as there is with the fescue that you have, there's also some limitations to it, or some things that you don't necessarily care for about it. And if it's so dominant that that's all you have to deal with, and you have to manage what you have, okay? I'm not saying that you just jump ship and say, well, I'm going to manage for everything else and forget about the fescue. No, you have to manage what you have. But there are some things that you can do, possibly, that will help encourage some other things along the way. And in this case here, this is a crested, has the same attitude that seems to be here with the fescue. It is there, it's not going anywhere, we just have to get the most out of it because it is what it is. Well, don't put the box around that quite so quickly. Okay? There might be some options out there. I'm not saying I have the answer for you or that this is a slam dunk, no-brainer, this will fix all your ills. I'm just saying that maybe there's some small experimentation that you can try, animal impact-wise, that will help you move that along. Make some observations about that picture. There's got to be some things you don't like about it. Erosion. Possibly some overgrazing. What do you think the water quality is like? Probably not real good. Okay, this is an operation. This is in southern North Dakota. This is an operator at this time was in the early 90s. Cow-calf operation, 2 or 3 pastures, so minimal rotation. This was the main water source, so they had access to that at pretty much all times, all during the season. Not a real good situation. Okay? If you have a water, in our case, if we had when we have a water quality issue, we have to ask ourselves why these things are happening and try and get to the root cause of the problem. Okay, we've got poor water quality. Why? Well, the cows are in the water. Okay? Why are the cows in the water? Well, it's because they're not restricted, so they stay out of the water. Why are they not restricted so they stay out of the water? That's the water source. Management dictates what happens. Okay? Now, we've had quite a few discussions over the last couple days about whether to fence it or not to fence it. And in my opinion, I'm not necessarily against exclusion fencing, but we got to fix the problem first, which is the management of all this. Then there may still be a reason to utilize that type of fencing. Okay? There certainly might be. But we have to get to the root cause of the problem. You got to peel enough layers back to get to the real thing. And I'll show you another picture here in a minute that highlights that, because on this management here, because of intentional use of grazing and animal impact over the course of about 10 years, with lots of recovery, minimizing overgrazing, but with heavy animal impact, this is that same stream bank. If you want trees, let's graze strategically to grow trees. If you don't want any trees, let's graze in such a way that we don't end up with trees. If you want water quality, we can do that too. Exposure time is huge. Okay? If we still have some issues in certain areas, we may need to fence parts of it out. Absolutely. Okay? But until you fix the problem first, you don't even know what you have. If all you do is chase symptoms, it's no different than the tail wagging the dog at times. Let's get to the root cause of this. Ask as many questions as we need to get to the bottom of it. Let's do a little Sherlock Holmes type investigation here, and let's figure this thing out. Unique situations on every place, certainly, and different answers on different places. Okay, how about this one here? Make a couple observations about that one. You think there's overgrazing? Okay, possibly. Water quality issues? Maybe. Erosion? Maybe not as much. Okay, maybe still some, but maybe not as much. This is in central Montana, and I asked this gentleman, I said, since we're only here for a tour for a couple days, I said, can you show me some place where you did this exact same treatment last year? Not that this is their normal way of going about business, but I said, can you show me where you did that treatment last year? And he said, sure. But he said, you probably won't believe me. And I said, well, I've been wrong before, and I've already made a bunch of judgments on here. So I said, you better show me, because I don't want to judge a book by its cover. Animal impact, positive stress, followed by long recovery periods. Those two things go together. Those two things need to go together. Now we have grass growing all the way through. And I know this is a little bit different site, but do you notice the similarities in terms of width and depth and different things with this water stream as before? This is just around the corner and down just a little ways. You see how yellow and kind of gray and non-growth oriented this looks? This is the exact same day. Okay? They consider themselves, at least at this time, they consider themselves a net importer of topsoil. Why? Because they catch it with their massive filtering system. Where do you think it's coming from? The neighbors. His neighbor is his cousin. His cousin has since caught on to this whole deal. Now his management has changed as well, which is better long-term anyway. Okay? Let me give you another example. This is up in Canada, so the fact that this is Canada thistle makes complete sense. Okay? Middle of Saskatchewan. Wowota, Saskatchewan is actually the place. Neil Dennis, longtime mob grazer, and he will tell you that when he went to his first holistic management class, when he went to his first mob grazing class, he was the guy that sat in the back, crossed his arms, and said, well, I'll listen to you, and then I'm going to go home and I'm going to prove you wrong. I'm going to prove that that doesn't work. And he did, and he tried for 2 or 3 years to prove that it doesn't work, and his place kept getting better and better and better until finally he said, well, screw that. I guess it does work. But how his started is he farmed conventionally for lots of years until he ran out of money. Okay? When you run out of money and the bank won't give you money for seed, for herbicide, for fertilizer, for fuel, what are your cropland fields that have been lots of tillage over the years? What did they grow up into that year? Lots of weeds, right? Okay, he didn't really have much choice. Okay, he didn't have any of those inputs to manage any of those things. Well, his neighbor calls him and says, you know, I've kind of run out of grass for one of my herds. Do you have anything to graze? Well, technically, yes, I have something to graze. Is it what you would probably prefer? Probably not. But come take a look at it. Here's what I have. What do you think? Well, here was going to be his deal with mob grazing that he was going to prove wasn't going to work. Okay, he's got this patch of Canada thistle. He's got 330 of the neighbor's heifers that he gets to use as his, guinea pig type of experiment. And he turns them in there. Do cattle eat Canada thistle? Or do cattle eat Canada thistle? Maybe not every stage of growth, but yes, they will eat it. Do they need to eat it to impact it? What else could they do to it? Stomp it, trample it, poop on it, do whatever, roll in it, lay on it. 2 days later, 2/10 of an acre is about the size of this deal. 330 heifers 2 days later. And they did all those things you guys just listed. Okay? Ate, rolled on, laid on, stomped on, etc., etc., etc. This is after 1 year, so I gave it that real long recovery period. Still some Canada thistle in there. Quite a bit less, but still some in there. Let's do it again. Okay, animal impact, short period of time, long recovery time. Here's 4 years later. You can't find one out there. Now, if you left that alone, or if you didn't graze it with good management and that sort of thing, might some Canada thistle start to show up again? If you go back to the old management, sure. You even might still get one from time to time. That wouldn't bother me much. But what did he do here? He didn't just have the cattle eat and trample the Canada thistle. He changed the whole soil environment in that area. And I'm not saying he changed the soil type. I mean, he changed the biology that was in that soil. Okay? The types of bacteria and fungal component and nematodes and protozoa and the whole community moved. It shifted some. So now all of a sudden it's in an area that isn't quite so keen on growing Canada thistle. Okay, but remember, some of that lots of his farm was tilled ground, and now all of a sudden it's not being tilled anymore. It had been used to lots of a certain type of fertilizer, and now all of a sudden it's not being fed that anymore. So are there other things that show up, that step up to the plate? Well, sure. And a lot of times it's that biology that makes that difference. So my suggestion for you is to create an enclosure. Okay, a lot of times from a range management standpoint, we talk about creating an exclosure, and that's possibly a good thing to do as well, but that's to monitor grass that hasn't been grazed or hasn't been impacted. I'm encouraging you to do the opposite thing and create another one, but this one, call it an enclosure. Create some heavy impact in that area, leave it fenced, and give it a really long recovery period. It might be an acre, it might be 2 acres, it might be 100 feet by 100 feet. Whatever you decide, whatever you want to try, Do it someplace where nobody else can see if you don't want anybody else to watch. Put it out next to the road if you want people to see. Okay, that's up to you. Some people like being talked about. Other people would prefer not to. Whatever your comfort zone is fine. But do this for you. Do this for your land. Do this for your soil. And give yourself something to watch. Give yourself something to play with. Give yourself some anticipation of what's going to happen. Okay? Wouldn't it be nice to be on your farm and be on the edge of your seat, but for a good reason? Okay? Start creating some of those things that you can be a part of, take some ownership in, and this would be one of those particular items. Now, in balancing all of this, there's land performance, and it doesn't have to be versus livestock performance, but we certainly need to emphasize one or the other from time to time. If you're going to graze a bunch of Canada thistle, if you're going to really create a bunch of impact, do you want to do that while you're trying to breed your cows? Probably not. How about at calving time? Probably not. How about to wean a bunch of calves onto Canada thistle? Probably not. How about when you wean the calves off of the cow and their nutritional requirements drop down quite a ways? Would that maybe give you a little bit of an opportunity? Certainly. Okay? Pick and choose the times to work on some of these things, and sometimes you can kind of massage some of these items a little bit, even during those critical periods, as long as you make sure you're paying attention to performance. Account for wildlife, we talked about that as far as how much forage they might consume. You might have alternative forages, crop residues, cover crops, hayland that you might decide to graze rather than hay all the time, so you can keep it in production, high production, longer. Managing for that underground herd, dung beetles. Okay, not that everybody's as interested as I am at going and kicking over poop piles and seeing how many critters blow out of there, but knowing that they do things that I can't do and that most other species don't necessarily do. Do you guys, during the summertime, are flies an issue? Or other things similar to that? Okay, guess what competes with them? Guess what flies around with these guys? A whole army of mites that also compete with fly larvae. Okay, if you want your own insecticide program, then all you got to do is recruit a few guys. Here's the first ones I would recruit. Okay, but we got to watch our management in terms of doing things that make sure that they can and are willing to participate rather than leave the party. All of this is all well and good, but if you don't monitor your progress or lack of progress, you may not know if you're going in the right direction or not. Okay? So before you end up below the water, get out there, get on your hands and knees, monitor something. Do something that you're going to continue to do. Okay? It doesn't need to be long transects. It doesn't need to be doing the hoops or the squares or any of those things if that's not what you're going to keep up with. Or utilize the resources that you have with Extension or with NRCS or the soil districts. Those people also can help with those sorts of things and be teammates for you. Okay, just to finish up here, cause or effect. Or another way to say it is problem or symptom. And I was going to grab one of those grazing sticks and I forgot. That's all right. Do you guys understand the problem versus symptom mentality? What shows up and flares up in front of us usually? Symptoms. Okay? It's no different than if I grab this microphone over here, and I won't actually do this, Chris, and this is why I was going to have the grazing stick. But if I stand over here and I start to clobber him over the head with this microphone, what's he going to eventually develop? A headache, right? Which might be a problem, but is it the cause of the problem that he has a headache? That he asked for Tylenol or Advil or aspirin or whatever he asked for? No. It's that for some reason he's getting hit over the head with this thing here. And you think, well, that's pretty simple. That's kind of elementary. Most of the things that we address in agriculture, we go chasing symptoms. It's what we don't like to see. It's what we don't like to hear. It's what we don't want to be accused of having in our pastures. It's land performance, it's animal performance, and that's what includes all of these things here. We have to start addressing causes, because when you start addressing the cause, guess what happens to most of the symptoms that are tied to it? they leave too. Most of the holistic ranches, the successful ones, the ones that make money, that have a regenerating land base, and whose people are happy and excited to do what they do, it's because most steps that they take are a step forward each time because they are unwilling to chase around symptoms. They address problem and then on to the next problem. They address the cause, the cause, the cause. And by doing that, they are making significant progress. They're not taking baby steps forward, they're taking quantum leaps forward. But we have to ask questions, we have to be willing to investigate. And one of the things about learning, when we're young and we're going through, first grade and second grade and keep on moving through junior high and through high school, when we're learning things, we're constantly learning new things. That doesn't necessarily mean that we have to unlearn the things that we had learned previous, right? It's a constant building process. Well, what happens when you get into a business like this and someone challenges your paradigm? Sometimes we have to make a decision. We actually have to unlearn some things in order to learn new things. We haven't had to do that as we were growing up. That was just a constant stream. That's what makes this so much harder sometimes, is the fact that we have to let some things go in order to move on with new things. This whole cause and effect thing is a perfect example of that all of the things that we've maybe done in the past, or some of the things that we've done in the past, and I've done many of them where I've gone after symptom because that was the right way to do things. I'm interested in doing the right things. Okay? Watering systems, fencing systems, those could be presentations in and of themselves, but there's a financial component to building infrastructure into your grazing system so that you can give yourself the flexibility to manage it. So you give yourself the opportunity to manage it. If you just have a couple of pastures, you don't have much opportunity to change things up. If you're like Ken Miller or a Gabe Brown or Blackleg Ranch and you've got 30, 40, 50, 80 pastures, you have a ton of opportunity to manage and to specifically manage the whole operation. And speaking of grazing planning, my wife didn't really care much about the grazing plan, one way or the other. Whatever you decide, Josh, that's fine. Whatever your dad and you decide, that's fine. Until the grazing plan started interfering with vacation. And I said, if we're truly holistic about how we plan our grazing, there is a people component. There is a pasture that is called our vacation pasture. Okay, it's a little bit bigger than the rest. It lasts for quite a while. It's got good, reliable water. It has good fencing. It is a long ways from the road. Guess where they tend to go when we're gone? Unless there's someone else to watch the livestock, guess where they go? And some might say, oh, but you shouldn't be grazing it that way. Okay, you should be mobbing during that time. No, you need to make this work for you. Now, don't let that be a cop-out to say, well, I don't need to do anything because I'd rather not do any of that. But you need to be flexible. You might be mobbing sometime. You might be sacrificing a pasture sometime. You might be in a simple rotation another time. You might be heavy use sometimes, very light use sometimes. You might not even be around sometimes. And we need to have a flexible enough grazing system to be able to do all of those things. Because if you do something that's not sustainable from a labor standpoint or from a focus standpoint, that's not going to work either. Okay, I'd rather someone have a simple rotation of a few pastures that they're going to be able to keep up with, rather than someone who goes out and mobs for a whole year and is so burnt out by the end that they never want to see a cow again. Okay? Now, I believe that as you see results, you will be more curious, and you will want to go further. And you will see those benefits, and you will start to get to the point where some of these guys say, I can't afford not to continue to explore and continue to push the envelope because there's just so much that happens. That's why it's so important that we tie this whole thing together. Finances, family, and what we do with the resource itself. So it is there. Not only for our cows, not only for our recreation, not only for our food, but for our kids, our grandkids, and keep on moving in that direction. And keep in mind that as you embark on new items, new trails, new concepts, it's real easy to fall back into what you were doing before. And I'm not saying that what you were doing before was necessarily all bad, but just know that just because it was a comfort zone, the last of the old way is usually going to be easier than the first of the new. You need to have some patience. You need to keep pushing on. You need to keep trying it, because you might go through a little bit of a lull or a little bit of a dip, but the benefits on the other side when you manage this way for soil health in a holistic manner, I'm not sure that there is a ceiling on the other side. Thank you.
We're a few minutes over, but we'll take a couple of questions for Josh real quick. Any questions? One back here.
I understood this morning that you were going to tell about setting up, taking iron, setting up a fencing that automatically rotated during the day. I'm anxious to hear that, or did I misunderstand?
Okay, the question was, this morning I described a fencing system that moved cattle multiple times a day, but that it only took them about an hour to an hour and a half in the morning to actually set it up. And I'm assuming the question is, how does that work, or what does it actually all include? And what it is they will set up enough total area for what those animals will need for the whole day. And then they will divide it up into sections so that they will have enough for maybe 3 or 4 hours at a time. What happens on those breaks that they put in there, okay, there's water at one end, and there's kind of a long, somewhat narrow area that they then break into sections. And those breaks in there consist of polywire to a gate area that's, I suppose it's 12, 16 feet, something like that. And what they use is they use a bungee cord. Okay, that's what's actually going across the gate, and what that bungee cord gets attached to is a little box about this big, and it's got a solar panel on the side of it. Okay, just a little solar panel on here, and and that solar panel runs a timer. It runs a timer, and it runs kind of like a corkscrew. And what that corkscrew has in it is, after it turns so far, then, because you hook the bungee cord into that deal, and after it turns so far, whether you set it to 2 hours or 4 hours, it will release that hook. And since it's a bungee cord, guess what that gate does? It shoots back that way and out of the way. Okay? And then this little box, it's got a little strap on this side, then it just kind of drops down and hangs on the post that you put it on. And it's pretty interesting, because after these cattle, and in this case yearlings, after this has happened for about 3 or 4 days in a row, about 10 minutes before that is going to release, they start to pick up their heads. They start to just real quietly saunter over towards the gate, okay? And all of a sudden, ping, and there it goes, and they file into the next one, okay? And in this setup, they probably had 4 or 5 of those little units that ran bungee cords. And of course, that whole setup, the perimeter would have kind of been set up before, but it takes them about an hour to an hour and a half to set up those breaks in each of these kind of long, narrow pens that they set up on that cropland. And of course, since it's on cropland, they want it all temporary because they want to be able to take it all off then when they come in there to seed something else, or if they seed an annual crop or harvest or whatever it might be. So we can use the combination of natural tools, if you will, with the grazing, the animal impact, all the biology, etc. But we can augment the management of those with some uses of technology. We need to be careful that we don't start replacing biology with technology, which has happened quite a bit over the last couple of decades, because I don't think it's a even or one-for-one type deal, but there are really beneficial ways that we can put those together. Take a lot of work. Now these guys, they wouldn't mind moving cattle every 4 hours. That's really what they love to do. But they also know that there's some other beneficial and very effective and financially beneficial things they do on their place, so they can't necessarily be there every 3 to 4 hours. Thank you. Mm-hmm. Those the automatic gate openers. I'll have to get you a card. I don't deal with them, but there's actually this Neil Dennis up in Canada, the Canada thistle, mob graze your neighbor cows type guy. He's actually a dealer for them, and if he doesn't have them, he knows where to get them. So if you're interested, I can point you in the right direction.
All right, we better tie things up, and this concludes the meeting. Josh will be around for a little bit if you have questions. Let's give Josh a big hand.